The Cold War lasted 44 years, produced roughly 70,000 nuclear warheads, and killed an estimated 14 to 20 million people in proxy wars around the world. But the two countries that started it had been allies just a few years earlier. They literally fought side by side to defeat Hitler. Yeah, seriously. The same two countries that won World War II together almost destroyed the world trying to beat each other. A city of 2.5 million people was kept alive entirely by airplanes for over a year because one side blocked every road. One man's vote on a submarine stopped a nuclear torpedo from starting World War III, and it all ended because one leader tried to save his country and accidentally destroyed it instead. So how did the allies who won World War II become the enemies who almost ended the world? To understand the Cold War, you first have to understand how World War II ended, because the alliance between America and the Soviet Union was never a friendship. It was a deal. They both hated Hitler more than they hated each other. But as soon as Hitler was dead, they looked across the table and realized they had absolutely nothing in common. America wanted free elections and free markets across Europe. The Soviet Union wanted communist governments and buffer states. And now, these two countries were the most powerful nations on Earth, standing in the rubble of Europe, trying to figure out who was in charge. At the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, the new American president, Harry Truman, sat across from Joseph Stalin. Roosevelt had been friendly with Stalin. Truman was not. And when Truman casually mentioned that America had tested a powerful new weapon, Stalin barely reacted. He already knew about the atomic bomb. His spies had been stealing American nuclear secrets for years. So Europe was divided. Here is the map of Europe after the war. The western half over here was democratic, backed by America and its allies. The eastern half over here was communist, controlled by the Soviet Union. And in 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech in Missouri and described this divide perfectly. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. He was right. Now it's 1947, and things are getting worse. Greece and Turkey over here are both in danger of falling to communism. Britain says it can no longer afford to help them, so President Truman goes to Congress and asks for $400 million. Communism is spreading. Where? Greece, Turkey, probably everywhere else next. What do we do? Send money. How much money? $400 million. For two countries? Would you prefer to spend it on World War III? Send the money. Congress approved it. This was the Truman Doctrine. America was now officially in the business of stopping communism wherever it showed up. But Truman didn't stop there. Secretary of State George Marshall announced a plan to rebuild all of Western Europe. $13 billion to 16 countries. Lots and lots of money. In today's dollars, roughly $150 billion. Hey, Soviet Union, we're rebuilding Europe. $13 billion. Want some? No. It's free money! It's a trap. It's literally free money. We don't want it, and neither do our allies. Have you asked them? They don't need to be asked. Stalin refused, and he blocked every Eastern Bloc country from joining. Then he tried something bold. Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, right here. But the city itself was split into 4 occupation zones. West Berlin was a tiny democratic island surrounded by communist territory. In June 1948, Stalin blocked every road, every railway, and every canal into the city. 2.5 million people were cut off. We just blocked every road into Western Berlin. No food, no coal, no nothing. 2.5 million people. Let's see how long they last. What if we fly it in? Fly what in? Everything. Everything? By airplane? Yes. That's not possible. We're sending the planes right now. You'll run out of planes before we run out of patience. We'll see about that. The Berlin airlift lasted over a year. American and British planes flew more than 278,000 flights and delivered over 2 million tons of supplies. At its peak, a plane landed in West Berlin roughly every 30 seconds. Stalin lifted the blockade in May 1949. Not a single shot fired. The first great confrontation of the Cold War was over. But 1949 brought 2 shocks that changed everything. First, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb on August 29th. America's nuclear monopoly was finished. The arms race had begun. Second, Mao Zedong won the Chinese Civil War and declared the People's Republic of China on October 1st. A quarter of the entire world's population had just gone communist. We lost China! We didn't lose China. A quarter of the world just went communist. What do you call that? China was never ours to lose. Well, someone lost it. Can we stop arguing about who lost China and start making allies? Lots and lots of allies. And so, 12 countries formed NATO right here in Washington on April 4th, 1949. The idea was simple. An attack on one is an attack on all. The Soviet Union would later respond with its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. But the Cold War wasn't just about threats and alliances. It was about to become a real shooting war. Now it's 1950. On June 25th, North Korea invaded South Korea right here across the 38th parallel. The United Nations sent troops, mostly American, to push them back. General MacArthur pulled off a brilliant, ambitious landing in Incheon, and the North Koreans were on the run. But then MacArthur pushed too close to China up here. China sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers pouring across the Yalu River and drove the Americans right back south. The war ground on for 3 more years and killed over 2.5 million people. An armistice was signed in July 1953, but no peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war. By now, both sides had built something even worse than the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, hundreds of times more powerful than anything dropped on Hiroshima, and both sides just kept building more. Stalin died in March 1953, and a man named Nikita Khrushchev eventually took charge. In 1956, Hungarians tried to break free from Soviet control. Students and workers took to the streets, a new government declared neutrality and pulled out of the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union sent in 200,000 troops and over 1,000 tanks and crushed the whole thing. About 2,500 Hungarians were killed. 200,000 fled as refugees. The message was clear. Once you're behind the Iron Curtain, you're not getting out. Then, on October 4th, 1957, something unexpected happened. Sir, the Soviets just put a satellite into orbit. A satellite? What does it do? It beeps. It beeps. Yes, sir. It goes around the Earth and it beeps. So the Soviets can put objects in space and we can't? That is correct, sir. I want a space program on my desk by Monday. Sir, we don't have a space program. That's what I just said. Make one. America created NASA. The space race was on. So how close did the world actually come to nuclear war? Now it's the 1960s. In May 1960, the Soviets shot down an American spy plane over their territory. The pilot, Gary Powers, survived and was captured. Huge embarrassment for the United States. In August 1961, the Soviets and East Germans built a wall right through the middle of Berlin. 27 miles of concrete cutting through the city. Families separated overnight. About 2.5 million people had already fled from east to west since 1949, and the wall made sure nobody else got out. In April 1961, America tried to overthrow Fidel Castro by landing 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs right here. Most of them were captured within a day. Complete disaster. But it pushed Castro straight into the arms of the Soviet Union, and that came with nuclear missiles. In October 1962, an American spy plane photographed Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, right here, 90 miles from Florida. Nuclear weapons that could hit most major American cities within minutes. You put nuclear missiles in Cuba. They're for defense. Defense? They can reach Washington in 3 minutes. You have missiles in Turkey that can reach Moscow in 10. That's completely different. How is that different? Because those are our missiles. Exactly. President Kennedy announced a naval blockade of Cuba. Soviet ships were heading straight for the blockade line. American forces went to DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. The whole world held its breath for 13 days. And on October 27th, the whole thing almost went catastrophically wrong. A Soviet submarine near Cuba was being hit with depth charges by the US Navy. The captain wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo. The political officer agreed, but a man named Vasily Arkhipov refused. All three officers had to agree, and Arkhipov said no. One vote. That one man may have prevented nuclear war. Back in Washington and Moscow, a deal was reached. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba, America would publicly promise not to invade Cuba, and secretly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced the missiles would come out. 13 days. The closest the world has ever come to destroying itself. After that scare, both sides installed a direct phone line between Washington and Moscow so leaders could talk before things got out of hand again. And they signed a treaty banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere. We came too close. Never again. But the Cold War didn't cool down. It just moved somewhere else. Now it's 1964, and America is getting pulled deeper into Vietnam down here. After North Vietnamese boats allegedly attacked a US warship in the Gulf of Tonkin, Congress gave President Johnson authority to escalate. By 1969, over 500,000 American troops were fighting in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The war killed over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. On April 13th, 1975, Saigon fell. The last Americans were evacuated by helicopter from the roof of the embassy. America's first clear defeat. Meanwhile, the Soviets had their own problems. In 1968, Czechoslovakia tried reforms. A leader named Dubček called it socialism with a human face. The Soviets invaded and shut it down. Same result as Hungary, same message. But by the early 1970s, both sides were exhausted. In February 1972, President Nixon did something nobody expected. He flew to Beijing and shook hands with Mao Zedong. The United States and China had been enemies since 1949. Nixon played the Chinese and the Soviets against each other, and it worked. The Soviets got nervous and started negotiating. Both sides signed the SALT Treaty in 1972, freezing the number of nuclear missile launchers. This period was called detente. For a moment, it actually looked like the Cold War might wind down. It didn't. On Christmas Day, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Done here. 100,000 troops to prop up a communist government. America armed the Afghan fighters through the CIA. It became the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Nearly a decade, over 1 million of Afghans died, and it drained the Soviet economy at the worst possible time. Now it's the 1980s. Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He launched the biggest peacetime military buildup in American history. He announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a system in space that could shoot down Soviet missiles before they arrived. The press called it Star Wars. We're building a missile defense system in space. In space? Yes. That shoots down nuclear weapons? Yes. From space? Correct. You're out of your mind. Possibly. But can you afford to find out if it works? The Soviets couldn't. Their economy was already falling apart. They were spending roughly a quarter of their entire GDP on the military, while ordinary citizens stood in line for bread. In March 1985, a younger leader named Mikhail Gorbachev took power. He introduced two big reforms. Glasnost meant openness. People could criticize the government for the first time. Perestroika meant restructuring. He tried to modernize the economy. Gorbachev wanted to save the Soviet system. Instead, he cracked it open. Then on April 26, 1986, a nuclear reactor at Chernobyl in Ukraine exploded. The worst nuclear disaster in history. The government tried to cover it up at first, but glasnost meant everyone found out anyway. Chernobyl became a symbol of everything wrong with the Soviet system. The lies, the incompetence, the decay. In December 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles. It was the first treaty that actually reduced nuclear weapons instead of just limiting how many you could build. But Gorbachev's reforms had done something he never intended. He opened the door and everything walked out. So how did the most powerful rival America had ever faced collapse in just 2 years? In 1989, the whole thing fell apart at once. Poland held free elections in June, Hungary opened its border with Austria over here, and East Germans started pouring through. Protests swept across East Germany, and on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. People climbed on top of it with hammers and chisels while the guards just watched. 28 years after it went up, the wall came down in a single night. Then the rest of Eastern Europe went with it. Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, where the dictator was executed on Christmas Day. One by one, every communist government fell. Germany reunified on October 3rd, 1990. In August 1991, Soviet hardliners tried a coup against Gorbachev. It failed in 3 days. And on December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The red flag came down over the Kremlin. The hammer and sickle was replaced by the Russian tricolor. After 44 years, the Cold War was over. At its peak in 1986, the world had roughly 70,000 nuclear warheads, enough to destroy the planet several times over. The United States alone spent over $5 trillion on nuclear weapons. An estimated 14 to 20 million people died in proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan and dozens of countries in between. It never became a direct war between them, but it came down to one man on one submarine saying no. If you'd rather listen than watch, whether you're cooking, driving, working, gaming, or falling asleep, we're on Spotify too. Links in the description.